The morning sun bore down heavily on Dallas, casting a shimmering heat haze over the city's towering skyscrapers. Inside the glossy offices of Exxonmobil's headquarters, the atmosphere was just as stifling. Jimmy Carter, the CEO, stormed into the conference room, his designer shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. His reputation preceded him. Ruthless, arrogant, and utterly indifferent to anything that didn't serve his bottom line. He was the type of leader who demanded results, tolerated no excuses, and dismissed emotions as weaknesses. Seated at the far end of the long mahogany table was Luna Morera. Her hands rested steadily on her portfolio, though her heart raced in her chest. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, meticulously rehearsing every possible scenario. Her hair, a crown of natural curls, framed her face, and she wore a tailored suit that screamed professionalism. Everything about her exuded competence and determination. Jimmy's eyes swept over her briefly, his expression unreadable but unmistakably cold. Without a word, he slid into his chair and picked up her resume. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of papers rustling. Finally, he looked up. "Ms. Morera, do you truly believe you belong here?" His tone was sharp, laced with condescension. Luna inhaled slowly, refusing to let his demeanor shake her. "Yes, Mr. Carter. My education, experience, and achievements speak for themselves. I believe I'm more than qualified to add value to your team." Jimmy chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He leaned back in his chair, tapping her resume against the edge of the table. "Confidence is a good thing," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let me tell you something about this company, Ms. Morera. We don't just hire based on qualifications. We look for compatibility. Someone with your, let's say, background might find it challenging to fit into certain circles here." The air in the room shifted. Luna felt a lump rise in her throat, a mix of anger and humiliation burning in her chest. She had heard similar insinuations before, thinly veiled racism disguised as corporate speak, but never so brazenly, so unapologetically delivered. She took a moment to compose herself, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, I believe I've demonstrated my ability to excel in any environment. If you don't see that, then perhaps the problem isn't with me." Jimmy smirked, unfazed. He gestured toward the door. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Morera. That will be all." Luna stood, clutching her portfolio tightly. She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unflinching. Her voice, calm but cutting, echoed in the silent room. "You don't know who I am, Mr. Carter, but you will soon." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Jimmy momentarily stunned. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially by someone he considered so far beneath him. As the door clicked shut, he leaned back in his chair, staring at her resume. There was something unsettling about her words, something that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. But, as he often did with things that made him uncomfortable, he dismissed it. He had no idea that his world was about to be turned upside down. Long before Luna Morera stepped into the Exxonmobil interview room, her life had been a testament to resilience. Born and raised in the heart of Dallas, she grew up in a modest neighborhood where opportunity rarely knocked. Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, was the pillar of their home, instilling in Luna a deep sense of determination and pride. From a young age, Luna stood out. She excelled in school, her teachers often marveling at her intellect and tenacity. Yet, she was no stranger to adversity. Walking to school, she'd pass by polished office buildings downtown, imagining herself one day working in one of them. But in the same breath, she'd hear whispers from people who doubted her. "Girls like her don't make it that far. She'll just end up like the rest." Those words stung, but they fueled her. High school was a battlefield. Luna juggled advanced placement classes while helping her younger siblings with homework and sometimes working late shifts at a local diner to support her family. On weekends, she devoured books about engineering and environmental science, subjects that fascinated her. She dreamed of creating sustainable solutions for communities like hers, where neglect and pollution were all too common. But life wasn't kind. During her senior year, her mother fell ill, and the hospital bills piled up. Luna almost dropped out to take care of her family, but her mother, even from her hospital bed, refused to let her give up. "You have a gift," her mother had said, her voice weak but firm. "Don't let this world take it from you. You're meant for more." Luna kept going. She graduated top of her class and earned a scholarship to one of Texas's most prestigious universities. The campus, with its sprawling lawns and historic buildings, felt like another world, a world where she often felt out of place. She was one of the few black women in her program, and the microaggressions came frequently. "Did you really get in on your own merit? Must be nice to have a diversity quota on your side." But Luna was relentless. She joined engineering clubs, won research competitions, and earned internships that put her on the radar of major corporations. One professor even called her the future of sustainable energy. Yet, the corporate world wasn't any easier. At one of her first internships, a supervisor took credit for a groundbreaking idea. At another, she overheard colleagues mocking her for bringing her natural hair to work. Every setback tested her resolve, but each time, she reminded herself of her mother's words, "You're meant for more." By the time she graduated, Luna had a reputation for brilliance. She had offers from companies across the country, but chose to stay in Dallas, where she could be closer to her family and give back to her community. Her ultimate goal was to join a company like Exxonmobil, where she could push for real change in the energy sector. When she received the invitation to interview with Exxonmobil, she thought it was a sign that all her hard work was finally paying off. She spent weeks preparing, researching the company's initiatives, and crafting a vision for how she could contribute. She walked into that interview room believing it was her moment, but Jimmy Carter's words had reminded her that no amount of preparation could shield her from prejudice. Leaving that room, she felt the familiar sting of doubt trying to creep in. For a moment, she questioned if all her efforts had been worth it. Then she remembered who she was. Luna Morera wasn't just any candidate. She wasn't just a girl from a struggling Dallas neighborhood. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had overcome every barrier life had thrown at her. As she walked away from the Exxonmobil building, her heart burned with a mix of pain and determination. Jimmy Carter didn't know it yet, but he had just underestimated the wrong person. Jimmy Carter's rise to the top of Exxonmobil wasn't the result of pure luck. It was a relentless climb, riddled with calculated decisions, a laser-focused ambition, and more than a few questionable choices along the way. From his modest beginnings to his current role as one of the most powerful executives in the energy industry, Jimmy's story was one of triumph, but also one of compromise. Jimmy grew up in rural Texas, the son of a small-time mechanic and a school teacher. His family didn't have much, but they valued hard work and discipline. Jimmy, however, was different from his peers. He wasn't just driven to succeed. He was obsessed with being the best. Mediocrity wasn't an option. From the time he was a boy, he resented the limitations of his upbringing and longed for a life of influence and luxury. In high school, he excelled academically and socially, becoming valedictorian and captain of the debate team. But even then, his ambition was tinged with a certain ruthlessness. Jimmy didn't just want to win. He wanted to ensure no one else could come close. This mindset followed him to college, where he earned a scholarship to the University of Texas. At UT, Jimmy majored in business administration, quickly distinguishing himself as a sharp, strategic thinker. He joined prestigious fraternities, networked with wealthy students, and made a point of aligning himself with professors who could open doors for him. But his charm and intellect masked a darker side. Jimmy wasn't above cutting corners or using others to advance. One incident in college marked a turning point in his journey. He partnered with another student, Michael Morera, a quiet, intelligent young man who shared Jimmy's business ambitions, on a major project. Michael was a brilliant strategist, and together they developed an innovative plan for sustainable energy investments. But when it came time to present their work, Jimmy took full credit, sidelining Michael entirely. Michael confronted him after their professor praised Jimmy for his visionary ideas. "You use me," Michael had said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You can't just erase people like that." Jimmy's response was cold and calculated. "Welcome to the real world. If you don't want to be left behind, learn to play the game." That project secured Jimmy an internship with Exxonmobil, a stepping stone that would define his career. Meanwhile, Michael disappeared from Jimmy's radar, a casualty of his relentless ambition. Over the next 2 decades, Jimmy climbed the corporate ladder at Exxonmobil with remarkable speed. He was a master negotiator, known for brokering deals that others thought impossible. He had an uncanny ability to read people, using their strengths or insecurities to his advantage. But his success came at a cost. Colleagues whispered about his cutthroat tactics and his dismissive attitude toward diversity and inclusion. As he rose to the position of CEO, Jimmy became the embodiment of corporate power. His tailored suits, luxury cars, and sprawling mansion in Dallas symbolized the life he had always dreamed of. Yet, beneath the surface, he carried the weight of his compromises. Jimmy justified his actions by telling himself he was simply doing what was necessary to survive in a brutal world. But there were moments, fleeting and uncomfortable, when he questioned whether he had sacrificed too much. He buried those doubts, focusing instead on maintaining his empire. That's why, when Luna Morera walked into the interview room, Jimmy didn't see a brilliant, determined woman. He saw someone who reminded him of the people he had left behind, the people he had learned to dismiss as unworthy of standing beside him. But something about Luna lingered after she left. Her name tugged at a long-buried memory. Morera. It was familiar, yet he couldn't place it. Jimmy brushed it off, assuming it was coincidence. He had more important things to focus on. What he didn't realize was that Luna's presence wasn't a random occurrence. She was connected to a part of his past that he had spent years trying to forget. And soon, that past would come knocking, forcing Jimmy to confront the man he had become. 2 days after the interview, Jimmy Carter sat in his corner office, the skyline of Dallas stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The afternoon sun bathed the room in a golden glow, but Jimmy wasn't in the mood to appreciate the view. Something had been gnawing at him ever since the interview with Luna Morera. He had dismissed her with the same cold indifference he showed to anyone he deemed unworthy of his time, but her parting words kept echoing in his mind. "You don't know who I am, but you will soon." Jimmy prided himself on being unshakable, yet there was something unsettling about Luna's quiet confidence. She didn't leave that room defeated. She left with purpose. And her last name, Morera, was starting to sound less like a coincidence and more like a clue. With a sigh, Jimmy buzzed his assistant, Karen. "Can you pull the file on that Luna Morera from the interview? I want her background details." Karen, efficient as always, delivered a folder within minutes. Jimmy flipped through it quickly, his sharp eyes scanning for anything unusual. Ivy League degree, impressive internships, fluent in 3 languages. All of it painted a picture of an exceptional candidate, one he dismissed with little more than a glance. But it wasn't her qualifications that made him pause. It was her lineage. Her father's name, Michael Morera, jumped off the page like a ghost from his past. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't thought about Michael in years, not since their fallout in college. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, the realization washing over him. Luna wasn't just another candidate. She was the daughter of the man he had betrayed all those years ago. For a moment, he let himself revisit that chapter of his life. Michael had been one of the smartest people he'd ever met, someone who had trusted him implicitly. They'd worked together on a project that could have launched both of their careers, but Jimmy had been too focused on his own ambitions to care about loyalty. He'd taken Michael's ideas, claimed them as his own, and left his former partner to pick up the pieces. Jimmy remembered Michael confronting him in the dormitory hallway, anger and betrayal etched into his face. "You'll regret this one day," Michael had said. Jimmy had shrugged it off. Regret wasn't something he allowed himself to feel. But now, staring at Luna's file, regret wasn't something he could ignore. He closed the folder and rubbed his temples, trying to think. Was this a coincidence? Had Luna intentionally sought him out? And if so, what was her endgame? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Karen stepped in, holding an envelope. "This just arrived for you. It's marked personal." Jimmy frowned as he took the envelope. There was no return address. He opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, but it sent chills down his spine. "The sins of the father do not always stay in the past. You'll see me again soon." Jimmy's grip on the paper tightened. He didn't believe in coincidences, and this was no exception. Luna wasn't just a candidate with a stellar resume. She was here for a reason. For the first time in years, Jimmy felt genuinely unsettled. His carefully constructed world, built on decades of calculated decisions and ruthless ambition, was starting to crack. And he had the distinct feeling that Luna Moreira was about to expose every one of those cracks. The tension was palpable as Jimmy Carter walked into one of Dallas's most prestigious charity galas later that week. It wasn't an event he would typically attend. He preferred private, controlled settings over the chaotic mingling of high society. But tonight, he felt compelled to be there. Something about Luna Moreira's parting words and the cryptic letter had left him restless. The ballroom was a picture of elegance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the air was filled with soft chatter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The event was hosted by a prominent nonprofit focused on renewable energy initiatives, an irony that wasn't lost on Jimmy, considering Exxonmobil's mixed reputation in that arena. Jimmy circulated through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging practiced smiles. He was adept at blending into these settings, projecting an aura of control and charm. But tonight, he couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease. And then he saw her. Across the room, Luna stood near the stage, engaged in a conversation with a group of donors. She looked different from the composed candidate in the interview room. Tonight, she radiated power and poise. Her navy blue gown was understated but elegant, and her natural curls framed her face like a crown. She carried herself with a confidence that turned heads, her laughter echoing lightly in the room. Jimmy froze, his mind racing. What is she doing here? He hadn't expected to see her so soon, or at all. Luna caught his gaze, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was no surprise in her expression, no hesitation. She had seen him the moment he walked in, and now, with deliberate grace, she excused herself from her group and began walking toward him. Jimmy's instincts told him to leave, but his feet stayed rooted in place. Luna stopped a few steps away, a polite yet knowing smile on her lips. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, extending her hand. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her tone was cordial, but there was an edge to her words that only Jimmy could detect. He shook her hand, his grip firm but his confidence wavering. "Ms. Moreira, this is unexpected, is it?" Luna tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I assumed someone like you would support a cause like this." Jimmy caught the subtle jab but chose to ignore it. I like to stay informed about the initiatives shaping our industry, he replied evenly. Of course, Luna said, her smile never faltering. It's always good to be prepared for change. The conversation felt like a chess match, each word carefully chosen and loaded with meaning. Jimmy couldn't decide if Luna was playing a game or if she was simply toying with him. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. The crowd turned toward the stage, where the evening's host stood with a microphone. We are thrilled to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, someone who embodies the future of sustainable energy and community empowerment. Please welcome Luna Moreira. Applause erupted as Luna gave Jimmy a final glance, her smile widening just enough to convey her triumph. Then she turned and ascended the stage, leaving him standing in stunned silence. Jimmy watched as Luna commanded the room. Her speech was powerful and heartfelt, weaving together her personal story, her vision for renewable energy, and her dedication to creating opportunities for underserved communities. The audience hung on her every word, erupting into a standing ovation by the end. As Luna stepped down from the stage, she didn't return to her previous group. Instead, she made her way back to Jimmy, her expression calm but unreadable. You didn't think I was done, did you? She asked softly, her tone laced with both challenge and promise. Jimmy swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of control. Luna wasn't just here to make a statement. She was here to dismantle everything he thought he knew about power, influence, and redemption. Jimmy Carter left the gala that night feeling unmoored. For decades, he'd prided himself on his ability to control every situation, to anticipate every move, but Luna Moreira was an enigma. She hadn't just walked into his professional life. She was now a presence in his personal one, stirring memories and emotions he'd long buried. Back in his sprawling Dallas mansion, the silence felt suffocating. Jimmy poured himself a glass of scotch and sat in his study, staring at the flames dancing in the fireplace. He thought about Luna's poised demeanor, the way she commanded the room, and the message in her eyes, "I'm not going anywhere." He picked up her resume again, the name Michael Moreira glaring at him like a specter. Jimmy had convinced himself years ago that his betrayal of Michael had been a necessary step in his career. But now, faced with Michael's daughter, he wasn't so sure. The memories came flooding back. Michael's quiet brilliance, their late nights strategizing on business models, and that moment in the dorm hallway when Michael realized Jimmy had stolen his work. "You will regret this one day," Michael had said, his voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and fury. At the time, Jimmy had scoffed at the idea. Regret was for the weak, and Jimmy had no intention of looking back. But now, sitting alone in his opulent home, he felt the weight of those words. The next morning, Jimmy arrived at Exxonmobil's headquarters with a newfound restlessness. He dove into work, trying to bury his unease under meetings, contracts, and numbers. But it didn't help. Luna's face and her father's name loomed over him like a shadow. Later that day, Karen, his assistant, entered his office hesitantly. "Mr. Carter, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Jimmy's chest tightened. "Who is it?" Karen glanced down at the note in her hand. "Luna Moreira." Jimmy stiffened. He hadn't expected her to confront him directly. For a split second, he considered turning her away, but something inside him, curiosity or guilt, compelled him to agree. "Send her in." Luna entered with the same grace she displayed at the gala, her confidence filling the room. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm and met Jimmy's gaze head-on. "Ms. Moreira," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "To what do I owe this surprise visit?" Luna sat down but didn't relax. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Mr. Carter. You know why I'm here." Jimmy's jaw tightened. Do I? She opened her portfolio and pulled out a photograph. It was a faded picture of two young men, Jimmy and Michael, standing side by side, their arms slung over each other's shoulders in camaraderie. "You knew my father," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. Jimmy's breath caught. He hadn't seen that photograph in years. "Yes," he admitted finally. "I knew him." Luna's lips pressed into a thin line. "You didn't just know him. You betrayed him." Jimmy flinched at the accusation, the bluntness of her words cutting through his defenses. "That's a harsh interpretation," he said carefully. "It's the truth," Luna shot back. "My father was brilliant and you stole everything from him. You ruined his career before it even started. Do you have any idea what that did to him? To my family?" Jimmy exhaled slowly, his usual composure slipping. "I did what I had to do to survive in this industry. It wasn't personal." Luna's eyes blazed with anger. "It wasn't personal? You destroyed my father's future. He spent years trying to rebuild his life while you climbed to the top. And now you sit here, the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, acting like it was just business." Jimmy had no response. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, his carefully curated image of success cracking under Luna's relentless gaze. "You took everything from him," Luna continued, her voice trembling now. "And yet, despite all of it, my father never stopped believing in justice. He taught me to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against me." Jimmy swallowed hard. "What do you want, Ms. Moreira?" Luna stood, her expression fierce. "I don't want anything from you. I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to see that your actions have consequences. And I want you to know that I'm not going to let you dismiss me the way you dismiss my father." She turned and walked out, leaving Jimmy alone with the photograph. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small. As he stared at the picture, a question began to haunt him. Is redemption even possible for someone like me? The days that followed Luna's confrontation with Jimmy Carter were filled with a quiet but steely determination. Jimmy's reaction, or lack thereof, had only confirmed what she'd known all along. He hadn't changed. The man who had stolen her father's future all those years ago still lived in the same self-serving bubble, untouchable and unrepentant. But Luna had no intention of letting him off the hook. As a child, she'd been taught to fight for what was right. Her father had instilled in her the value of integrity, of standing up against the system even when it felt like the world was stacked against you. He'd worked tirelessly after his fall from grace, trying to rebuild his career and his family's reputation, but the scars of betrayal never truly healed. Now, Luna understood that it was her turn to carry the torch. She wasn't just fighting for her father's legacy. She was fighting for justice, for every person who had been overlooked or silenced by people like Jimmy Carter. Luna had spent the last few years building her career, working alongside nonprofits and organizations that focus on bridging the gap between underserved communities and industries dominated by the elite. Her passion for sustainable energy had fueled much of her work, but she knew her ultimate goal was always to take down the very system that had allowed people like Jimmy to thrive unchecked. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people who shared her vision of a more equitable future. And she knew exactly where to start. Over the next few weeks, Luna reached out to various journalists, activists, and whistleblowers within Exxonmobil who had been quietly collecting evidence of corporate corruption. She was strategic in her approach, never revealing her full intentions, but always pushing for small but significant cracks in the armor. It was a delicate balance of building trust and setting the stage for what she knew would be a massive revelation. But even as she built her coalition, Luna had to deal with the shadow of her father's past. The more she uncovered about Jimmy's rise to power, the more she realized how deeply entrenched his manipulation had been. There were deals hidden behind closed doors, people silenced, careers ruined, all for the sake of his ascent. Luna spent hours poring over documents, emails, and reports. She found references to her father's project that had been dismissed without consideration, notes on his ideas that were recycled under Jimmy's name. And then there were the financial transactions. Money moved under the table, bribes hidden in plain sight. It was all there, buried beneath layers of corporate bureaucracy. One afternoon, Luna met with a former Exxonmobil employee, Martin Garcia, who had worked in the legal department during Jimmy's early years as CEO. He was a middle-aged man with a weary expression, but his eyes still carried the weight of the secrets he'd kept for so long. "I didn't think anyone cared anymore," Martin said, his voice low as he handed Luna a stack of papers. "But if you're going after Carter, you should know that this is only the beginning. There's more, much more." Luna accepted the papers without hesitation. As she sifted through them, her hands shook with a mix of anger and determination. These documents weren't just proof of corporate malfeasance. They were the key to bringing Jimmy down. She knew that the public, especially the media, would be the final battleground. With the right information, she could expose Jimmy's lies, not only destroying his credibility, but also shaking the foundation of the entire company. But as Luna prepared to release her findings, she found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. The closer she got to uncovering the full extent of Jimmy's betrayal, the more she realized how deeply personal this fight had become. It wasn't just about her father's ruined career anymore. It was about her own journey, her own identity, and the legacy she was fighting to build. She thought back to the words her father had spoken to her on his deathbed, just a few months before he passed. "Fight for justice, Luna, but never lose sight of who you are. The world is full of people who will use you, who will break you to make themselves stronger. Don't become one of them." It was a lesson Luna had held close ever since. She knew that exposing Jimmy for what he was wouldn't be enough if she didn't do it on her own terms. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that his actions, his legacy of cruelty and exploitation, wouldn't go unchallenged. The time had come for Luna to confront him again, but this time, it wouldn't be a quiet meeting behind closed doors. She would do it publicly, with the full weight of the evidence behind her. As the day of the press conference drew closer, Luna's resolve hardened. She would face Jimmy Carter, not as a vengeful daughter, but as a force for change, a woman who had learned the hard way that power was meant to be used for good, not for personal gain. Jimmy had thought he could bury the past, that he could continue playing his game of dominance and manipulation. But Luna had other plans, and this time, she wouldn't let him escape. The day of the press conference arrived, and Dallas was buzzing with anticipation. The media had been tipped off about a major reveal from Luna Moreira, and speculation was running wild. Some said it was about corporate corruption. Others whispered about a new energy breakthrough. But Luna's silence had only heightened the intrigue. Jimmy Carter had been preparing for a different kind of day. He hadn't expected the storm that was about to hit him, or at least he hadn't fully understood the scale of the threat. He had been in business long enough to handle his fair share of crises, but this was personal. It started innocently enough. His assistant, Karen, had briefed him earlier in the day about a press conference being held by a key figure in the renewable energy sector. Jimmy had given it little thought. His focus was elsewhere, on a critical board meeting and an upcoming merger that could solidify his control over Exxonmobil's future. But when the name Luna Moreira surfaced in his briefing later that afternoon, his stomach dropped. Luna had been quiet since their last encounter, but the memory of her face, the fire in her eyes, lingered in his mind. She's not going to stop. The thought had gnawed at him for days. She had something. He wasn't sure what exactly, but he had a sinking feeling that today would be the day it all came to light. The conference was held in a sleek downtown Dallas hotel, its glass walls reflecting the gleaming skyline. Luna arrived early, accompanied by her team. The press room was packed with reporters, cameras poised and microphones in hand, all eager to hear the details of her announcement. Luna stepped onto the stage with the same unshakable confidence she had displayed at the charity gala. She was poised, composed, and resolute. The hush that fell over the room was palpable. "Thank you all for being here today," Luna began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the microphone. "I've spent the past several years of my life fighting for a better future, one where the powerful don't get to dictate the terms for everyone else, where people like my father aren't silenced for speaking out, where integrity matters more than profit." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. Jimmy watched from the back of the room, his jaw clenched. He was seated in the front row with several of his executives, trying to maintain a calm exterior, but inside, his heart was racing. "I stand here today not just as my father's daughter, but as someone who has spent her life fighting for justice. And I've uncovered something that should not be ignored. This is not just about my father. This is about a system that has allowed people like Jimmy Carter to thrive at the expense of those they trample." At her mention of his name, Jimmy stiffened. He was suddenly very aware of every eye in the room. It felt as though the walls were closing in. Luna's eyes scanned the room before locking onto Jimmy, her gaze unflinching. "You all know Jimmy Carter as the CEO of Exxonmobil, a man who has built his career on innovation, on progress. But what if I told you that his rise to power wasn't a product of hard work, but a betrayal?" The reporter stirred, and Jimmy's face flushed with anger. He knew what was coming. Luna took a deep breath, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "Several years ago, Jimmy Carter stole a project from my father, Michael Morera, a project that would have revolutionized the energy industry. He stole my father's ideas, his research, and buried his career. In the process, he silenced not only my father, but an entire generation of innovators who were working to make a real difference in this world." The room was dead silent. Jimmy's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to stand up, to shout, to refute the accusations, but his body felt frozen. Luna continued, pulling out a thick stack of documents from her portfolio. She slid them across the table, her voice unwavering. "These documents are proof of what I'm saying. Emails, contracts, financial transactions, each one tied directly to Jimmy Carter's theft of my father's work. This is the truth that he's been hiding, and I am here to make sure it's known." As she spoke, the press room erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Jimmy's mind raced. He had underestimated her, and now, in front of the entire world, his empire was crumbling. "Do you have any response to the allegations, Mr. Carter?" a reporter shouted. Jimmy's throat was dry. His mind was clouded. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a smear campaign," he said, his voice tight with control. "These are false accusations, and I intend to prove that. My success has always been earned through hard work and strategic decision-making. Luna's claims are nothing more than a desperate attempt to tarnish my reputation." But Luna wasn't finished. She turned to the side, nodding to a journalist who had been sitting quietly. The journalist stood and presented a series of confidential documents, a chain of emails between Jimmy and several high-ranking executives, confirming the covert deals that had led to the suppression of Michael Morera's work. The room fell into stunned silence. Jimmy's heart sank as he realized the evidence had already been made public. Luna stepped forward, her voice steady but fierce. "You can deny it all you want, Jimmy, but the truth is right in front of you. Your lies, your greed, your disregard for people's lives. None of that will go unnoticed anymore." As she spoke, Jimmy saw his empire, his legacy, slipping through his fingers. It wasn't just a company at stake. It was his entire life's work. And it was falling apart because of one woman, the daughter of the man he had betrayed. The press conference ended with Luna's victory clear for all to see. Jimmy Carter had been exposed, his career irreparably tarnished, and Luna had secured justice for her father and for herself. As she walked out of the room, her head held high, Luna felt the weight of the fight lift from her shoulders. She had won, not just for her father, but for everyone who had been oppressed, silenced, and forgotten. And in the end, Jimmy Carter had learned the hardest lesson of all, that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions forever.